Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for taking the time to join today's webinar hosted by Climate Integrate, Japan Policy Briefing on 7th Strategic Energy Plan, Climate Plan, and GX 2040 Vision. As it is time now, we'd like to begin today's webinar. I am Oki from Climate Integrate, and I will be moderating today's session. It is a pleasure to have you all here. Climate Integrate is a climate policy think tank that analyzes government policies and disseminates information. Today, we will discuss 3 major plans related to Japan's climate and energy policy, which were approved by the Cabinet on February 18th. The Strategic Energy Plan, Climate Plan, and GX 2040 Vision. We will provide their overviews and discuss the decision-making process behind these plans. To start, I will explain today's schedule. First, Yasui, our Director of Public Policy at Climate Integrate, will talk about the decision-making process behind the 3 plans. Next, our Executive Director, Hirata, will provide an explanation of the plans, followed by a Q&A session where we will take your questions. Please submit your questions via the Zoom Q&A function at any time. If possible, kindly introduce your affiliation along with your name when submitting your question. Additionally, if you support a particular question, please use the like button. Due to time constraints, we may not be able to address all questions, and we appreciate your understanding. The materials for today's webinar can be accessed and downloaded through the QR code on this slide or through the link that will be shared in the chat. This webinar is also being recorded and will be made available as an archived video at a later date. Now, let's begin with an explanation of the policy decision-making process behind the 3 plans from Yasui. Hello everyone, my name is Yasui and I am the Director of Public Policy at Climate Integrate. Please give me a moment. Today, I will explain the policy decision-making process of the 7th Strategic Energy Plan, the Climate Plan, and the GX 2040 Vision, how they were structured, and the process through which they were decided. I'll be using a pointer. First, regarding the overview of each plan, the Strategic Energy Plan is formulated based on the Basic Act on Energy Policy under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry. This plan is reviewed at least once every 3 years, and since the previous plan was decided in October 2021, the fiscal year 2024 was the scheduled revision period. This plan outlines fundamental policies and measures regarding energy supply and demand. Climate Plan is formulated based on the Act on Promotion of Global Warming Countermeasures under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of the Environment of Japan. The Prime Minister is responsible for seeking cabinet approval for this plan, and as the head of the Global Warming Countermeasures headquarters within the Cabinet Secretariat, the Prime Minister serves as the overseeing minister. Like the Strategic Energy Plan, this plan is reviewed every 3 years and sets overall greenhouse gas emission reduction targets and the measures needed to achieve them. Finally, the GX 2040 vision. It is officially formulated based on the Act on Promoting the Smooth Transition to Decarbonized Growth-Oriented Economic Structure, commonly known as GX Promotion Act, under the jurisdiction of the Minister of Economy, Trade and Industry. In July 2023, a strategy called the GX Promotion Strategy was formulated based on this law, and the GX 2040 vision serves as an update to that strategy. Next, regarding the decision-making structure of these three plans. For the Strategic Energy Plan, the law requires the Minister of Economy, Trade and Industry to draft the plan based on the opinions of the Advisory Committee on Natural Resources and Energy, which is established under the Agency for Natural Resources and Energy. Under this Advisory Committee, there are 4 subcommittees, including the Strategic Policy Subcommittee, as well as smaller working groups that discuss specific topics. The discussions from these groups, as well as OCTO at the bottom, a working group on electricity supply and demand scenarios, are consolidated in the Strategic Policy Subcommittee, where the draft of the Strategic Energy Plan is formulated. Compared to the previous 6th Strategic Energy Plan, there have been minor changes in committee names and structures, but the fundamental structure remains legally mandated and unchanged. Next, regarding the Climate Plan and NDC. NDC, Nationally Determined Contribution, is a term that has not been mentioned so far, but it refers to the emission reduction targets that each country submits to the United Nations every 5 years under the Paris Agreement. It is considered as an integral part of the Climate Plan. The Climate Plan and NDC are discussed in a joint meeting of the Central Environment Council of the Ministry of the Environment and the Industrial Structural Council of the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, where a draft is formulated. Ultimately, the draft is finalized by the Cabinet Secretariat's Global Warming Prevention Headquarters and then approved by the Cabinet. Regarding the decision-making process of the GX 2040 vision, the Cabinet Secretariat has established the GX Implementation Council, which includes a leaders panel and working groups that discuss issues such as industrial structures, industrial locations, and emissions trading systems. The GX Implementation Council then compiles the draft and seeks Cabinet approval. The minister responsible for GX implementation is concurrently the Minister of Economy, Trade and Industry. In summary, the decision-making process for these 3 plans is closely interlinked and is predominantly led by the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. Next, I will explain the deliberation process for the current Strategic Energy Plan. This diagram is quite detailed, but it illustrates the relationship between the Strategic Policy Committee shown on the far left and the 12 other committees, specifically when each meeting was held and how discussions from each committee were incorporated into the deliberations on the Strategic Policy Committee over time. The deliberation process for this Strategic Energy Plan began in May of last year within the Strategic Policy Committee. It continued with hearings and discussions on individual topics, and by December 25th of last year, a draft was compiled, following a public comment period of approximately 1 month after the turn of the year. The plan was approved by the Cabinet on February 18th. Throughout this process, numerous committees covering various fields such as energy conservation, renewable energy, nuclear power, and resource fuels held continuous discussions as indicated on the far left of the diagram. The content discussed and coordinated in these committees was then systematically reviewed and approved within the Strategic Policy Committee. The draft of the Strategic Energy Plan, including elements shown in the diagram as well as those not explicitly mentioned, underwent extensive coordination before its formulation. Therefore, by the time the public comment phase took place at the final stage, most of the content was already finalized. The number of public comments submitted during the formulation of the 6th Strategic Energy Plan was about 6,000, whereas this time, over 41,000 comments were received. While this represents a significant increase in public input, our understanding is that the amendments made to the draft in response to these comments were minimal. One notable procedural change from the previous process was that the Strategic Policy Committee conducted hearings with youth organizations for the first time as a result of the increased discussion about biases in committee composition and decision-making processes. However, fundamental issues such as the Secretariat-led process and biases in committee membership remained unchanged. Additionally, in terms of biases, there was an over-reliance on the specific institutions' analysis for energy supply and demand scenario projections and cost assessments. The results of this scenario analysis were presented at the December 3rd meeting, and with the finalization deadline at the end of December approaching, there was insufficient time to thoroughly review this analysis. This led to a situation where energy supply and demand projections were determined based primarily on the analysis of a single institution, which we see as a key issue. Next, this diagram illustrates the relationship between the deliberation processes for the climate plan and the GX vision. At the top, we see the Strategic Policy Committee, which, as I mentioned earlier, conducted its deliberations in parallel with various meetings related to the climate plan and GX vision. As indicated by the lines extending from the Strategic Policy Committee and the Central Environment Industrial Structure Councils to the GX Implementation Council, the climate plan and energy plan proposals were taken into account in the formulation of the GX 2040 vision. As I mentioned earlier, these three plans are integrated. However, unlike the councils dealing with energy-related matters, there was limited direct interaction between these deliberation processes. One notable issue in the climate plan discussions occurred towards the end of the November 25th meeting, when the Secretariat presented the emission reduction targets. Committee members were divided over the proposed linear emission reduction trajectory. In December, 3 intensive discussions were held on this proposal. Yet, no consensus was reached. Nevertheless, the decision was made to proceed with the Secretariat's proposal for a linear reduction trajectory. Given this background, this episode can be seen as a prime example of a decision-making approach with a foregone conclusion. In summary, while some procedural improvements were observed compared to the 6th Strategic Energy Plan, the fundamental decision-making structure, where the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry exerts significant influence, remained unchanged. Moreover, public opinion was not meaningfully reflected in the process. This concludes my assessment of the formulation process for the 7th Strategic Energy Plan, Climate Plan, and GX 2040 vision. That concludes my presentation. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much. Some parts may have been a bit rushed, but a detailed analysis of this decision-making process is scheduled to be published in the form of a report around spring. Once the report is completed, we will inform you again. Next, Hirata will explain the overview of the 3 plans. Hello everyone, this is Hirata from Climate Integrate. Earlier, we had an introduction to the highly complex process through which the 3 plans, the 7th Strategic Energy Plan, the Climate Plan, and the GX 2040 Vision were decided on February 18th. This process is extremely complex, and following discussions in national councils is not easy unless one has a strong interest in the matter. However, regarding the 7th Strategic Energy Plan in particular, an unprecedented number of opinions were expressed, reflecting an increasing public interest in energy and climate change issues. The finalized plan can be viewed from different perspectives, depending on one's standpoint and focus. However, within our limited time, we'd like to present a summary of what has been decided in this plan. First, let's look at the overview and the key characteristics of the 7th Strategic Energy Plan, which has broad implications. Since the previous plan was formulated, there have been major developments such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the rise of DX and AI, and increasing electricity demand. Additionally, the plan takes into account current perspectives on climate change and industrial policy. Major characteristics are shown here. The key principles remain the same as before, following the S+3E framework: safety, energy security, economic efficiency, and environment. However, due to factors like the invasion of Ukraine, the emphasis on energy security has become even stronger. Another notable change is the revised outlook on electricity demand. While the 6th plan projected a decline in electricity demand, the new plan assumes a steady increase due to the expansion of data centers and semiconductor factories. Furthermore, the plan moves away from relying on specific energy sources and instead promotes a balanced mix, including renewable energy, nuclear power, and fossil fuels. While renewable energy is still considered a primary power source, the policy shift regarding nuclear energy is significant. After the Fukushima nuclear accident, the government aimed to reduce dependence on nuclear power. However, this plan reverses that stance, now actively promoting nuclear energy, including the replacement of old reactors with new ones at existing sites run by the same operator. So in Japan, where Fukushima accident occurred, this change of stance was shown. At the same time, the continued use of thermal power, particularly LNG, liquefied natural gas, remains a focus. The integration of industrial policy within the GX, Green Transformation Strategy, aims to balance economic growth and industrial competitiveness. Additionally, the plan acknowledges that decarbonization efforts come with high costs. If these costs become excessive, the plan includes mechanisms to control them. to put a brake on them, particularly in the manufacturing sector, where high costs could undermine competitiveness. While decarbonization remains a goal, a cautious approach is being taken to balance economic factors. The plan also presents multiple scenarios, such as one with increasing renewable energy, another with expanding hydrogen use, and yet another with advancing CCS, carbon capture and storage, and a scenario with maximum use of all these technologies. They also present a scenario where decarbonization progress is limited or reversed, where CO2 emission cannot be reduced. The energy supply and demand outlook I am about to explain does not involve simply adopting one of these scenarios. Instead, it is distinct from the scenarios and aims to present the policy direction that energy policy should pursue. In other words, it serves as a vision. This means that the outlook may change depending on various assumptions. For instance, even if technological advancements do not progress as expected, policies are in place to ensure a stable gas supply so that people are not affected. The figures I will now explain are not set as obligations or targets. Rather, they are positioned as directional goals, which is a key feature of the Strategic Energy Plan. In contrast, the sixth Strategic Energy Plan had a stronger emphasis on setting targets. Now let's take a look at the data, specifically the energy supply and demand outlook. The figures are presented here, but please focus on the graph on the right. It illustrates the trend from the base year 2013 to the present 2022, as well as projections for 2030 and 2040. The seventh Strategic Energy Plan specifically outlines the energy landscape for 2040. However, the 2030 figures in this graph were added by us, based on the numbers used when the sixth Strategic Energy Plan was formulated. The government does not explicitly present the 2030 figures, instead jumping straight from the present to 2040. The previous plan projected a decline in electricity demand, but going forward, demand is expected to increase. Since there are still about 5 years until 2030, it is likely that the electricity demand projection will be revised upward. However, as these updated figures have not yet been released, we have used the previous figures for reference so that you can observe the trends. A key point of discussion in this deliberation was the breakdown of electricity generation by energy source. To achieve cleaner electricity, it's desirable to maximize the share of renewable energy. The debate focused on what percentage renewables should account for, and I will touch on this later. Japan's energy consumption is not limited to the electricity sector. A significant portion of energy is used in the form of heat and fuel, with substantial consumption of petroleum, gas, and coal. While final energy consumption is projected to decrease and electricity demand to increase, the heat and fuel sectors remain highly dependent on fossil fuels. However, concrete measures for decarbonizing these sectors have not been thoroughly explored. The discussions have largely focused on electricity, and a significant portion of the deliberation was dedicated to this area. Although the 2040 outlook aims to pave the way for carbon neutrality by 2050, the concrete path to full decarbonization remains unclear. Next, let's focus on the electricity sector and power generation mix. Currently, Japan is highly dependent on thermal power generation, particularly coal, which is the most carbon-intensive energy source. Despite this, Japan still relies heavily on coal as well as gas. At present, renewable energy accounts for approximately 23% of the power mix. The government has set a target for 2030, aiming to reduce thermal power to 42%, including ammonia and hydrogen, and increase renewable energy to 36 to 38%. The new figures for 2040 presented in this plan indicate that thermal power will account for 30 to 40%, renewable energy will increase to 40 to 50%, and nuclear power will remain at around 20%, similar to the 2030 level. Compared to today's energy mix, the projection suggests that renewable energy will roughly double by 2040, making it the primary energy source. This has been widely reported in the media. However, I'd like to draw attention to the gap between the 2030 and 2040 projections and how this transition is expected to unfold. The bar graph on the right side shows the 2030 target values, while the two central bars next to it represent the projections for 2040. Since there is a range of values, two bars are shown. If the progress of renewable energy by 2040 remains limited, it can be seen as being almost the same as in 2030. In particular, thermal power is expected to decrease from 42% to 40%, while renewable energy is projected to be between 36% and 38% in 2030, almost 40%. However, if renewable energy remains at 40% in 2040, there is still little change. Since the target values have a range, the aim is to reach the higher end, but if we look at the lower end, it does not appear that much energy transition is taking place in the power sector. Another notable point is that nuclear power remains at 20% without change. One aspect to highlight is that wind power, especially within the renewable energy sector, has shown only minimal growth. This is another key feature of this plan. The chart also includes more detailed information on each power source, but I will not go into detail. Please refer to the materials later. Key features are that in the 6th Strategic Energy Plan, the phrase principle of prioritizing renewable energy was symbolically included, but this time it's been removed. A target of 20 gigawatts is set for the introduction of a new perovskite solar cell technology, which allows solar panels to be installed on walls. Offshore wind power, which is expected to grow, remains unchanged from the target set in the 6th Strategic Energy Plan. However, this is merely an introduction target and does not specify when implementation will begin. Now on thermal power, there is a strong emphasis on LNG. Since LNG is a gas-fired power generation method derived from fossil fuels, the plan includes the construction of new thermal power plants and even support for them. This suggests investment in fossil fuels rather than a transition away from them. The biggest issue, coal-fired power, has seen little progress from the 6th plan. The government states that inefficient coal power will fade out rather than being completely phased out. The phrase reducing inefficient power plants remains unchanged. Globally, there is a push to eliminate coal power completely, regardless of efficiency, but no new plans for this have been established. Another point worth mentioning is the significant difference in CO2 emissions between coal and gas. Coal-fired power generation emits about twice as much CO2 as gas-fired power. However, from this time, the breakdown of these figures is no longer disclosed, making it difficult to visualize the trajectory of coal phase-out. Moving on to the climate plan. The climate plan is not limited to energy, but outlines how Japan will reduce all greenhouse gas emissions. As a result, it is the most extensive document in terms of volume. The newly set reduction targets compared to 2013 levels are 60% by 2035, 73% by 2040. These targets were determined by drawing a straight line from the 2013 baseline to the 2050 goal and selecting intersection points for each year. There are various background considerations, but the Japanese government explains that these values align with the global scenarios outlined by the IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees, making them both consistent with and ambitious for the 1.5 degree target. However, considering that the global average midpoint for reduction is around 66%, and that Japan, as a developed country, should take leadership, these targets are rather weak. While they technically fall within the scenario range, they are on the lower end. Additionally, Climate Action Tracker, a European and American scientific think tank, has proposed much more ambitious targets for Japan to align with the 1.5 degree goal. Many public comments raised concerns that Japan should aim for a more aggressive reduction target. As previously mentioned by Yasui, the NDC, or Nationally Determined Contribution, was the most controversial topic at the end of discussions surrounding the climate plan. In the end, the government's original proposal was adopted for NDC. The plan also outlines reduction targets by sector and greenhouse gas type. The government document provides these details, and a major update this time was the addition of 2035 and 2040 targets, whereas previously only 2030 targets existed. This was intended to clarify the path to 2050, but the data actually only extends to 2040. While 2040 figures are provided for each sector, the absence of numerical data for 2035 creates uncertainty about the pace of progress needed to reach the 60% reduction target by 2035. The 2040 figures suggest that among sectors using energy, the industrial sector, which produces the most emissions, has relatively lenient reduction targets of 57 to 61% compared to stricter reduction targets in sectors like transportation. Bilateral carbon credit systems. The plan also proposes allocating around 200 million tons to international carbon credit mechanisms, meaning Japan will count reductions achieved through overseas support toward its own targets. One technical point I previously omitted relates to energy-derived CO2. Let me go back to the slide. In the Strategic Energy Plan, figures include CO2 capture and sequestration, CCS, meaning emissions reduction is calculated under the assumption that CO2 is successfully captured and stored underground. The climate plan factors in CCS, so its figures reflect this technology working as planned. This is a very detailed point, but the plan also includes a comprehensive list of various measures by different ministries to achieve these goals. Lastly, we have the GX 2040 vision. This was compiled as an overarching summary, so it does not contain specific numerical targets. The document reiterates what GX, or green transformation, fundamentally is. It says it is shifting the industrial and social structures that have been centered around fossil fuels since the Industrial Revolution to a clean energy-based system. The overall direction of GX appears to emphasize a transformation closely tied to industrial competitiveness, industrial development, and economic growth. The GX 2040 vision, which has been compiled this time, aims to provide a long-term direction to enhance predictability for companies and the government as they invest in this transition. It serves to answer the questions like, is this really the right path? Are there any risks? Is it safe to invest in this? Furthermore, it is explained that this vision is not only for Japan, but also contributes to global decarbonization, particularly in Asia under the Asia Zero Emission Community or AZEC. Agreements with various countries are being made to play a role on the international stage. Another key aspect that has been made concrete is the growth-oriented carbon pricing system, which essentially means placing a cost on carbon dioxide emissions. Carbon pricing encompasses mechanisms such as emissions trading and taxation, and this has been integrated into the GX framework. This system was already incorporated into law last year under the GX Promotion Act, and its specific implementation measures have now been outlined. The plan details how emissions trading will be introduced for businesses and states that the government will establish guidelines on emission allowances. To prepare for the full-scale implementation of this system in 2026. The funds generated from this pricing system will be used to issue GX bonds, injecting investment into the transition. The revenue from this system will be allocated to GX bonds redemption. While this framework was introduced last year, the GX 2040 vision has now further clarified and formalized it. Regarding industrial structure, the document highlights concepts such as GX business creation using innovative technologies and demand aggregation in line with energy supply, indicating a large-scale and long-term approach that involves working together with industries. Compared to the two previous plans, this vision provides a more qualitative direction, which I personally find somewhat challenging to grasp. To summarize, these three plans have been released as a package, adopting an all-options approach that leverages all available technologies and pursues diverse solutions. While renewable energy will be promoted, fossil fuels and nuclear power will also remain important. This approach essentially continues the best mix policy that has been advocated for some time. However, from another perspective, the speed of transitioning from fossil fuels to clean energy appears to be rather slow. The vision strongly emphasizes a return to nuclear power and the necessity of a stable gas supply chain, which suggests that the pace of transitioning to renewable energy is insufficient. One reason behind this approach is the adoption of cost estimates from one single research institute that indicates renewable energy development is expensive. However, internationally and in places where renewables have already been implemented, costs have significantly decreased. The discussion on how to make renewable energy more affordable seems to have been neglected, leading to the assumption that renewables are expensive, which may have influenced the decision to adopt this all-options approach. Another major concern is the clarity of the commitment and roadmap toward decarbonization, given that last year already saw global temperatures surpass the 1.5-degree threshold and that Japan is the world's fifth largest emitter of CO2. the country bears a significant responsibility. The government insists that the 2035 targets are aligned with international goals and are ambitious, but external experts and research institutions have raised doubts. This raises a critical question. Does this plan truly demonstrate the commitment and determination needed to tackle the severe climate crisis? There remains significant skepticism in this regard. The large volume of public feedback indicates that many citizens are deeply concerned about this issue and seeking stronger action. Another particularly troubling aspect is that, as shown in the graph, the plan explicitly includes measures to secure gas in case decarbonization technologies do not advance and CO2 reductions fail to materialize. Why is a failure scenario being explicitly acknowledged here? Are they essentially saying, "We are sorry if it doesn't work out"? As shown in this graph, drawing a straight line suggests that the 2040 reduction target can be achieved. However, the numbers explicitly indicate that energy-derived CO2 emissions will not decrease that much. If emission exceeds expectation, energy-derived CO2 alone could remain at around 540 million tons, keeping overall emissions at roughly the 2035 level. This suggests a significant slowdown, and it even raises concerns that the government might already be assuming that achieving the targets is impossible. The third point is the insufficient backing of greenhouse gas reduction measures and data. A key concern is that while there is still a goal set for 2030, just 5 years away, the discussion has jumped ahead to 2040. This means there has been no thorough examination of whether the 2030 target can actually be achieved and to what extent the current policies will be effective. The pace of solar power adoption has slowed, and offshore wind power development is not progressing as planned, making it difficult to see how the 2030 reduction target can be met. Furthermore, phasing out inefficient and outdated coal-fired power plants is not progressing smoothly. If things continue as they are, achieving the 2030 goal seems unlikely. However, discussions on the current situation and the necessary policy reinforcements to address these challenges have been largely overlooked. Recognizing these issues should have led to measures such as accelerating the phase-out of coal power, revising cost structures and support measures to promote renewable energy, removing regulatory barriers, or expediting grid enhancements. Instead, these crucial discussions were left behind, and the focus shifted to numerical targets for 2040. Moreover, since there is no clear data for 2035, it remains unclear how investments should be allocated and to what extent renewable energy should be prioritized. The fourth point is the continued heavy reliance on fossil fuels. As shown in the earlier graph, even by 2040, Japan will still depend heavily on fossil fuels. Currently, Japan spends around 20 to 30 trillion yen annually on fossil fuel imports, and if this continues at a significant level through 2040, it will pose serious energy security risks. As a result, Japan's energy self-sufficiency rate is expected to remain low at around 30 to 40%. The impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on energy prices has already caused severe difficulties, and this dependence on unstable fossil fuel imports is likely to persist. If thermal power continues to account for 30 to 40% of energy production, Japan's decarbonization efforts will be severely jeopardized. Particularly, positioning LNG-fired power as a transition energy source seems contradictory to decarbonization efforts. Additionally, since there is no breakdown of thermal power generation, it is unclear how much will be achieved through measures such as ammonia co-firing, full ammonia combustion, or carbon capture and storage CCS. There is no visibility into the extent of their role or feasibility. This is my final slide. Once again, a strong shift toward nuclear power has been emphasized, with expectations that nuclear energy will account for 20% of power generation by 2030 and 2040. However, industry experts are well aware that achieving this target is highly challenging. Our analysis shows that even under the most aggressive restart scenario, nuclear power will not reach 20%. Realistically, it may not even reach 10%. Additionally, building new reactors would take approximately 20 years, making it impossible to achieve a 20% share by 2040. Nuclear power also faces numerous challenges, and given the historical difficulties in its implementation, relying on nuclear energy means that any shortfall will be covered by thermal power generation. This, in turn, will delay decarbonization efforts. To put it bluntly, looking at this entire plan as a package, rather than a concrete and credible roadmap for decarbonization, it appears more like an aspiration. It would be nice if we could decarbonize. The grand design for achieving carbon neutrality is still lacking. Additionally, as shown in the table below, Japan's approach does not align well with the international carbon neutral commitments it has joined. For example, while Japan has agreed to phase out coal-fired power, there is still no concrete plan to reduce it. This raises concerns about whether Japan's carbon neutral policies will truly progress. Now, here are key considerations going forward. Despite everything, the discussions around numerical targets, whether good or bad, have produced certain outcomes, and the cabinet has made its decision. Many of you here today are not government officials. And now, the question is, how reliably decarbonization can be pursued from this point forward? Ultimately, it depends on the choices we make and the actions we take. However, since much information remains unclear, it is crucial to ensure a transparent and fair process to monitor whether these targets and measures are actually being achieved. This includes external, objective evaluations. Moving forward, accelerating these efforts will be critically important. Particularly in the renewable energy sector, it is essential to rapidly increase local adoption utilizing rooftops and farmland, which hold great potential. Regarding floating offshore wind power, laws and introduction targets are expected to be established, so it will be necessary to develop a domestic supply chain and establish it as a key industry to secure electricity supplies. Additionally, improving grid flexibility, revising pricing structures, and implementing demand response measures will help shift demand and facilitate a policy-driven acceleration from both supply and demand sides. The goal should be to create an energy transition that allows for the efficient and cost-effective use of renewable energy. While carbon pricing is included in the plan, it must be implemented in a way that provides strong enough incentives to improve energy efficiency and expand renewable energy use. Lastly, under the GX framework, significant investments are being made in LNG and innovative technologies, but these investments carry considerable uncertainty and risks. Questions remain about whether they can truly be implemented and at an affordable cost. For instance, there are discussions under the Trump administration about selling and developing gas from Alaska, but such projects come with high costs and significant environmental impacts. If future investments continue to be linked to thermal power generation or the prolonged use of fossil fuels, they must be rigorously scrutinized. before implementation. Otherwise, they risk becoming stranded assets and undermining the urgent climate change measures that we must prioritize. This presentation has covered a vast and complex topic, but I have aimed to summarize and introduce this plan that has significant implications for all of us. That concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.